It was 10:17 on a stormy Thursday night when my phone buzzed with a message that made my blood run cold. Blue Lantern. Nothing else but those two words and a location pinned leading to my daughter Claire's house. For 25 years, no one had used that code. Not since the night my 13-year-old daughter asked me, "Mom, what if one day I'm terrified, but I can't tell you out loud?" Back then, I promised her that if she ever sent those words, I wouldn't ask questions. I would simply come. So I grabbed my truck keys and left before the screen had time to go dark. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove through Savannah's quiet streets. My heartbeat drowned out the radio. The message replayed over and over in my mind, forcing old memories to the surface. Lately, Claire had been canceling family dinners more often. My 8-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, had become strangely quiet whenever her father entered the room. And Daniel, my son-in-law, always smiled while correcting Claire in front of everyone, making cruel comments sound like harmless jokes. At every family gathering, something had felt wrong. I convinced myself it was simply marriage. I wanted to believe that. But tonight, that illusion was falling apart. At a red light, I called Harold Bennett, a longtime friend who had spent decades investigating military crimes before retiring. "I got the code," I said. His voice changed instantly. "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, I pulled onto Claire's street. The neighborhood looked peaceful, with perfectly trimmed lawns and warm porch lights glowing through the rain. Then I heard it. A little girl crying. Not the loud cry of a child throwing a tantrum. The quiet, frightened cry of a child trying not to be noticed. A man's angry voice echoed from inside the house. Something heavy crashed. Harold's SUV rolled to a stop behind mine. He climbed into my truck for only a moment before asking one question. "You armed?" "Yes." He nodded. Neither of us spoke again. We didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't an ordinary family argument. As we crossed the street, I noticed Sophie's small pink bicycle lying on its side near the bushes, soaked by the rain. For some reason, that image hit me harder than anything else. Children don't abandon their favorite things without a reason. Especially not in the middle of the night. I reached the front porch, turned the handle, and stepped inside without knocking. The smell of whiskey filled the air. Broken dishes covered the floor. Claire stood near the dining table, one hand wrapped around her ribs. A fresh cut stained the corner of her lip. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. Behind her, Sophie clung to a worn stuffed rabbit, trembling so hard her tiny shoulders shook. Across the room stood Daniel, holding a half-empty bourbon glass. The moment he saw me, his expression changed into a practiced smile. "Maggie," he said calmly. "This isn't what it looks like. I've spent 30 years reading people. And one thing never changes. The guilty almost always begin with the same sentence." Before I could answer, Sophie suddenly broke free from her mother and ran straight toward me. "Grandma." She buried her face against my chest, shaking uncontrollably. At that exact moment, I realized I hadn't arrived to stop something that had just begun. I had arrived far too late. And whatever had been happening inside this family had been hidden for a very long time. Sophie clung to me so tightly that I could feel her heartbeat racing through her little pajamas. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, though I wasn't sure she believed me. Children always know when adults are hiding fear. Harold gently stepped forward and knelt beside her. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a warm smile. "Think you can help me find something sweet in the kitchen? I heard there might be cookies." Sophie hesitated, looking at Claire for permission. Claire gave the smallest nod. Only then did Sophie slowly let go of me and follow Harold away. The room felt unnaturally quiet. Rain tapped against the windows while Daniel took a slow sip from his bourbon. "You two are overreacting," he said with an awkward laugh. "Every married couple argues." I ignored him. Instead, I looked at my daughter. Her hair was a mess. One sleeve of her sweater had been stretched as if someone had grabbed it. Most painful of all, she refused to look me in the eyes. That wasn't the Claire I had raised. She had always been strong enough to face difficult moments head-on. Tonight, she looked like someone afraid of making the wrong move. "What happened?" I asked softly. Before Claire could answer, Daniel stepped between us. "She got emotional," he explained. "A plate got thrown. Things got heated." Claire's shoulders stiffened. She still said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any explanation ever could. I slowly looked around the room. Broken ceramic pieces sparkled across the hardwood floor. A dining chair had been knocked over. Near the coffee table lay Sophie's coloring book, open to a page she had never finished. One purple crayon had snapped cleanly in half. Children don't stop coloring unless something steals their sense of safety. Daniel noticed where I was looking. "You're making assumptions," he said, his smile beginning to fade. "No," I replied quietly. "I'm observing." For the first time that night, his confidence slipped. He shifted his weight and glanced toward Claire. Then he reached for her arm. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was automatic. The kind of touch that said he believed he still had control over her. Claire instinctively stepped backward. It was only a few inches. But after 30 years in Army intelligence, I had learned one truth. Fear reveals itself in movements people don't even realize they're making. My stomach tightened. This wasn't the first time. It couldn't have been. I turned back to Claire. "Look at me." Slowly, her eyes lifted. They were filled with exhaustion. "Not from tonight. From months. Maybe years." "Did he hurt you?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she looked at Daniel. That single glance shattered every hope I had been holding on to. Victims don't ask their abuser for permission unless they've been living in fear for a very long time. Daniel immediately interrupted. "Don't answer that. She's overwhelmed." His voice remained calm. Controlled. Almost gentle. But underneath it, I heard something much darker. Ownership. As if Claire belonged to him. Before I could speak again, Harold returned from the kitchen with Sophie beside him. She was holding 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a paper towel. Harold met my eyes. His expression told me everything. He had already called the police. Daniel noticed it a second later. "You called the cops?" he snapped. "I did," Harold answered evenly. For the first time that evening, Daniel's face lost every trace of confidence. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the rain. And suddenly, the man who had spent years controlling everything inside this house realized he was no longer in control. The message reached my phone at exactly 10:17 on a stormy Thursday night. I was alone in my garage, carefully restoring an old cedar chest that had taken me nearly 3 months to rebuild. Rain drummed steadily against the roof while distant thunder rolled over the Savannah River. My radio played an old country song through bursts of static. Then my screen lit up. Blue Lantern. Below the words was a location pin. Claire's house. For a moment I couldn't move. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up, the way it always had before dangerous situations. That code hadn't been used in 25 years. Back when Claire was 13, after her father died unexpectedly, we'd created those 2 simple words. If she was ever in real danger and couldn't explain, she'd send them. No questions. No phone calls. I would come. Tonight, she had. Harold Bennett was already waiting outside when I stepped out of my truck. Rain poured from the dark Georgia sky as he zipped his old army jacket. "You think it's serious?" he asked. "If she used the code," I answered quietly, "it's worse than serious." Neither of us wasted another second. The shouting coming from inside the house became louder as we reached the driveway. A frightened little girl's crying drifted through the walls. "Sophie." Harold looked at me. "You ready?" I nodded once. Then we walked toward the front door. Inside, the smell of whiskey filled the house. Claire stood beside the dining table, one hand wrapped around her ribs. A split lip stained the corner of her mouth with fresh blood. Sophie hid behind her mother's legs, hugging her stuffed rabbit so tightly its ears bent sideways. Daniel stood near the kitchen island holding a bourbon glass. His expression changed the instant he saw me. "Maggie," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "This isn't what it looks like." Amazing how liars always choose the exact same sentence. Sophie suddenly broke away from Claire. "Grandma." She ran straight into my arms. Her whole body shook. I held her tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart." I knew she didn't believe me. Children always know when adults are pretending. Harold gently led Sophie toward the kitchen with promises of cookies while I kept my eyes locked on Daniel. Claire refused to look at me. That frightened me more than her injuries. Daniel started explaining. She got emotional. She threw a plate. Things escalated. Claire flinched when he stepped closer. It was almost invisible. But after 30 years in Army intelligence, tiny reactions often revealed more truth than words ever could. Fear has its own language. And Claire was speaking it without saying anything. I slowly looked around the room. Broken dishes. An overturned chair. Wine, or maybe bourbon, spilled across the floor. Sophie's crayons scattered beneath the coffee table. One pink crayon snapped perfectly in half. Children stop drawing when adults become dangerous. I turned toward Claire. "Did he hit you?" Silence. She looked at Daniel before answering. That single glance told me everything. This wasn't the first time. Daniel immediately interrupted. "You're making this into something bigger than it is." No. I was finally seeing it for exactly what it was. Minutes later, police officers arrived. Officer Carver immediately separated everyone. When she quietly asked Claire whether her husband had assaulted her, Claire hesitated. Again she looked toward Daniel. He gave the slightest shake of his head. Almost impossible to notice. Almost. Officer Carver noticed it too. "So did I?" the officer asked again. This time Claire's voice barely came out. "We both lost our tempers." Officer Carver didn't look convinced. Neither was I. Because victims rarely protect strangers. They protect the people they're terrified of losing. And that realization hit me harder than anything else that night. By the time the officers finished taking statements, Claire whispered something that broke my heart completely. "Mom." Her voice trembled. "Please don't leave us here." The next morning, my house felt different. Not peaceful. Just careful. Claire moved through each room as if she expected someone to criticize every step she took. Sophie refused to let her mother out of sight, following her from the kitchen to the laundry room, then back again without realizing she was doing it. Even Bo, my old golden retriever, seemed to understand something was wrong. He lay outside the guest bedroom door the entire night and refused to leave. Harold arrived just after 8 carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thick folder. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "So I started digging." Claire looked nervous. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share," Harold said gently. "But I think you deserve to know what I've already found." He opened the folder. There are thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses linked to Daniel's accounts. Luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, wire transfers, jewelry purchases. Claire slowly lowered her eyes. "I thought we were struggling financially." Harold sighed. "That's what he wanted you to believe." The room fell silent. For years Claire had skipped vacations, delayed buying new clothes, and worried about every grocery bill because Daniel constantly claimed money was tight. Meanwhile, he had been spending freely behind her back. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Harold slid another photograph across the table. Daniel stood outside an upscale restaurant with another woman. They weren't standing like coworkers. They were standing like a couple. Claire stared at the picture for several seconds before whispering, "I knew something felt wrong. I just kept convincing myself I was imagining it." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You weren't imagining anything." That afternoon Harold introduced us to Naomi Calloway, one of the toughest family attorneys in Savannah. She spent nearly an hour reviewing financial documents before removing her glasses. "What I'm seeing isn't just infidelity," she said calmly. "It's financial abuse." Claire looked confused. Naomi continued. "Controlling money. Isolating a spouse. forcing signatures, creating dependency. These are forms of abuse, just as real as physical violence. Claire slowly nodded. He always brought paperwork to me after arguments. Naomi looked up immediately. When you were emotionally exhausted? Claire swallowed. Yes. Naomi exchanged a glance with Harold. That's intentional. She explained how manipulators often overwhelm their partners emotionally before asking them to sign documents they normally would have questioned. By the end of the meeting, Claire finally understood something she had spent years blaming herself for. She hadn't been foolish. She had been manipulated. The following week, small victories began appearing. Claire opened her own bank account, changed every password, called 2 old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, applied to return to teaching children's art classes. The woman who had walked into my house terrified was slowly beginning to remember who she had been before Daniel convinced her she wasn't enough. Sophie changed too. She started laughing louder. She stopped jumping whenever a door closed. One afternoon she asked if we could bake cookies together. While we waited for them to finish, she looked at me and quietly asked, "Grandma, is Mommy happy here?" I smiled. "She feels safe here." Sophie's shoulders relaxed. "I like safe." Those 3 words stayed with me all night. Children should never have to recognize the difference between a safe house and an unsafe one. Daniel, however, wasn't giving up. Every day brought another message. One morning he apologized. "I'm so sorry. I made mistakes. Please come home." By afternoon the tone changed. "Your mother is destroying our marriage." The next day he blamed Claire. Then he blamed stress. Then alcohol. Then work. Every excuse except himself. Naomi warned us not to respond. Manipulation often becomes stronger when control starts slipping away. She was right. 3 evenings later, Daniel appeared at my front door without warning. Claire froze the moment she saw his car pull into the driveway. The fear on her face answered every question I still had. I stepped outside before he could knock. "I just want to talk to my wife," he said. "She doesn't want to see you. You don't get to make that decision." "Inside my house," I replied calmly, "I absolutely do." His polite smile began disappearing. "This whole military protector act," he muttered. "You're making everything worse." I stepped closer. "No. I'm making sure my daughter finally gets one thing she's been missing for years." "And what's that?" "A life where she doesn't have to be afraid." His jaw tightened. "She'll come back." I looked him directly in the eyes. "The biggest mistake you ever made was believing kindness meant weakness." For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel didn't have an answer. He stared at me for several long seconds before climbing back into his car. As he drove away, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Because once someone sees the truth clearly, fear begins losing its power. And Daniel's carefully built world was already starting to collapse. 3 weeks later, Daniel walked into the Savannah Children's Foundation charity gala believing he could still save his reputation. That was the strange thing about men like Daniel. Even after their private lives begin collapsing, they convince themselves that a polished smile and confident handshake can still erase the truth. The ballroom overlooked the Savannah River, glowing beneath crystal chandeliers while soft jazz floated through conversations between business owners, attorneys, doctors, and local philanthropists. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked perfect. Claire stood beside me near the entrance wearing a simple navy blue dress. She had almost cancelled that afternoon. "I don't belong here," she whispered. I looked at her. "You belong anywhere you can stand without being afraid." Naomi adjusted Claire's necklace before smiling. "Tonight isn't about revenge," she said quietly. "It's about refusing to hide." Claire nodded. Then, without saying a word, she removed her wedding ring and slipped it into her purse. It wasn't dramatic. It was freedom. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He wore an expensive tuxedo, his confidence returning with every handshake. Beside him stood Vanessa Cole. Several guests noticed them immediately. Whispers began moving across the room like a slow breeze. Daniel spotted us almost instantly. For a split second, surprise crossed his face. Then the familiar smile returned. He walked toward us carrying a glass of bourbon. "Claire," he said softly. "You look good." She didn't answer. His attention shifted to me. "I guess you've convinced everyone I'm the villain." "No," I replied calmly. "You managed that yourself." His smile stiffened. "You've always hated me." I shook my head. "I welcomed you into my family." "Those aren't the same thing." For the first time all evening, Daniel had no clever response. He walked away. But he looked back twice. Pressure was beginning to crack the mask. Earlier that week, Naomi had quietly submitted financial evidence to Daniel's company. Not accusations. Facts. Expense reports. Hotel invoices. Unauthorized reimbursements. Enough documentation to trigger an internal investigation. At the same time, Vanessa's husband had received undeniable proof of the affair. Truth didn't explode. It spread. Quietly. Patiently. Like water finding every crack in a foundation. Around 8 o'clock, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed. Executives who had eagerly greeted Daniel earlier suddenly avoided eye contact. Two senior partners whispered together while glancing in his direction. Vanessa noticed it too. "What is going on?" she asked nervously. Daniel forced a laugh. "Nothing." But even he no longer believed it. Moments later, two investigators from his company entered through the side doors. Harold, standing across the room with a glass of club soda, caught my eye and gave a single nod. Everything was happening exactly as Naomi predicted. One investigator approached Daniel politely. "Mr. Hale, we'd like a private conversation." Daniel frowned. "About what?" "Questions regarding several financial transactions." Guests nearby pretended not to listen. No one moved. No one interrupted. Respect disappears quietly before it disappears publicly. Daniel looked around the ballroom searching for support. He found none. Then another voice stopped him. "Daniel. Thomas Cole. Vanessa's husband." He walked forward with remarkable calm. His eyes never left Daniel. "I know about the hotels." Vanessa's face turned white. Daniel immediately tried to interrupt. "This isn't the place." Thomas answered without raising his voice. "You should have thought about that before using company money to pay for your affair." The room fell silent. No music. No laughter. Only whispers. Daniel's carefully constructed image had begun collapsing in front of everyone whose approval he valued most. He looked desperately toward Claire. For years she would have rescued him. Covered for him. Protected him. Not anymore. Claire met his eyes with a calm expression he had never seen before. For the first time since their marriage began, she wasn't afraid of what he might say next. And Daniel realized it. The confidence disappeared from his face. Replacing it was something far more unfamiliar. Fear. The ballroom remained silent. Daniel looked around as though someone would step forward and defend him. No one did. The investigators waited patiently. Thomas stood beside Vanessa without saying another word. Every excuse Daniel had rehearsed suddenly seemed too small for the truth surrounding him. Then he turned toward Claire one last time. "Please," he said, his voice unsteady. "Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." Claire looked at him for several long seconds. Years earlier, she would have apologized. She would have tried to calm everyone down. She would have carried the burden for him. But that woman no longer stood in front of him. "I protected your secrets for years," she said quietly. "I confused loyalty with fear." Daniel's shoulders dropped. "I'm not protecting you anymore." Those words echoed through the room more loudly than any shout ever could. One of the investigators stepped forward. "Mr. Hale, we need you to come with us." This time, Daniel didn't argue. As security escorted him toward the exit, he glanced back one final time. Not at the crowd. Not at the investigators. At Claire. She simply turned away. The chapter was over. Life didn't magically become perfect after that night. Real healing never happens all at once. The divorce took months to finalize. Naomi successfully recovered part of Sophie's education fund and secured primary custody for Claire. Daniel was granted limited visitation until he completed court-ordered counseling and alcohol treatment. Justice wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork, hearings, difficult conversations, and small victories earned one step at a time. Claire returned to teaching art at a local elementary school. Every afternoon she came home with paint on her hands and stories about children who believed every drawing deserved a place on the refrigerator. For the first time in years, her smile reached her eyes. Sophie changed too. She laughed more. She slept peacefully. She stopped asking whether people were angry before entering a room. One Saturday morning she rode her bicycle across my driveway without training wheels. When she reached the end, she turned around, raised both arms in the air, and shouted, "Grandma! I did it!" Claire clapped beside me, tears filling her eyes. It wasn't about the bicycle. It was about freedom. Late that summer my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. It was Daniel. His voice sounded tired. "I lost everything," he admitted. I remained quiet. After a long pause he asked, "Do you think Claire will ever forgive me?" I looked through the kitchen window. Claire was helping Sophie water flowers in the backyard. Both of them were laughing over something I couldn't hear. Finally I answered. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for because you're lonely." Silence. Then I continued. "If you truly want redemption, become the kind of man who never makes another family live in fear." He whispered, "I don't know where to start." You start by accepting responsibility instead of looking for someone else to carry it. After another long silence, he quietly said goodbye. That was the last time we ever spoke. One evening, Sophie and I sat together on the dock watching the sun disappear beyond the river. She leaned against my shoulder. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart? Were you a hero in the army?" I smiled. "No. But Mom says you saved us." I looked toward the house where Claire stood on the porch, smiling as Bo chased birds across the yard. Then I looked back at my granddaughter. "The real heroes aren't always the strongest people," I said softly. "Sometimes they're simply the ones who show up when someone they love is too afraid to ask for help." Sophie thought about that before slipping her small hand into mine. As the evening breeze drifted across the water, I realized something that years in the army had never taught me. Courage isn't measured by battles won. Sometimes courage is answering two simple words. Blue Lantern. And refusing to arrive too late.